Today on In Your Face Anatomy, we are talking about the pituitary gland. Right, Kraken? All right, the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is way up at the base of the brain. It's kind of on the underside of our brain, actually, at the bottom part of our brain. It's also known as the hypophysis cerebri. Hypophysis cerebri. We find it inside of the sella turcica. So remember in Anatomy 1, when we talked about the structures of the skull, we have the sella turcica, which is also known as the Turkish saddle. And it's a little bony kind of cavity in here, but that's where our pituitary gland sits, so it gets some protection from the bony outcropping that pops up around it, helps protect it a little bit more. So it sits in the sella turcica. It's connected to my hypothalamus via the pituitary stalk, but the pituitary stalk is also known as the infundibulum. The infundibulum, the pituitary stalk. We refer to our pituitary gland a lot of times as the master gland because it also secretes a lot of tropic hormones, or hormones that have some impact on what some of the other endocrine glands and hormones are doing in our body. So we refer to it as the master gland. That is my pituitary gland. And it's subdivided into two regions. I have an anterior pituitary gland, also known as my adenohypophysis, and my posterior pituitary, which is my neurohypophysis. So anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary. We kind of drawn a picture of it over here to the side. Anterior one is going to be in the front. Posterior one then is going to be in the back behind it. There's my infundibulum, or my pituitary stalk, connecting all of that to my brain. Now we're going to treat our anterior pituitary and our posterior pituitary like two different glands. Yes, it's one pituitary gland in two regions, but we're going to really treat it like two different glands, because they secrete different things. My anterior pituitary secretes certain hormones. My posterior secretes other hormones. But before we get to the actual hormones themselves, we need to talk about the 5 types of secreting cells of the anterior pituitary. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to begin this with the anterior pituitary just because it's more complicated. So I have 5 different kinds of cells in my anterior pituitary that are secreting 6 different hormones. 5 cells doing 6 different hormones. So let's look at some of these cells because they're going to come back into play in just a moment. So my first type of cells for my anterior pituitary gland are called somatotropes. And somatotropes secrete growth hormone. That's their job. Somatotropes secrete growth hormone. Now we'll see coming up, growth hormone has an AKA of somatotropin. So growth hormone is also known as somatotropin, which gets its name from these cells, the somatotropes. That's why we call it somatotropin, because it's secreted by somatotropes. So make that correlation between some of these secreting cells and the AKAs for some of these other hormones we have coming up, and it makes your life a little bit easier. Mammotropes are our second type of secreting cells. They secrete prolactin. That's pretty straightforward, I think. You think lactate, mammary gland, mammotropes, prolactin. All of that flows pretty good. With our thyrotropes, we're making reference to the thyroid gland, and it secretes TSH, which is thyroid-stimulating hormone. So we have another correlation between the two. TSH is also known as thyrotropin for that same exact reason, because it's secreted by the thyrotropes. We got corticotropes secreting ACTH. So cortico and the C in ACTH is cortical at the same time. So it's kind of some overlap there. And then our gonadotropes, our last type of secreting cells, actually secrete the last 2. They secrete FSH and LH. So FSH and LH are types of gonadotropes. They act on the gonads. These are some of our big puberty hormones that help us go through those changes when we reach our adolescence. So 5 types of cells to be familiar with, and what they secrete are 6 different types of hormones. So let's look at that first type of hormone we get from our anterior pituitary. That is growth hormone. Let me see. Growth hormone. How well you guys can see that? I hope the glare is not too bad. I apologize if it is. Growth hormone, we just said, is also known as somatotropin. So now that's coming into play because growth hormone was secreted by the somatotropes. Now you may often see this as HGH. That just stands for human growth hormone. I don't think we really need to make that distinction in a human anatomy class, but if you do see it as HGH, that's all it stands for, human growth hormone. Now, growth hormone, as its name would suggest, it's going to stimulate our cells to enlarge, divide, or grow. It's also going to encourage our cells to regenerate, lengthen the long bones. Everything you would think something called growth hormone would do, it's doing. It's helping everything to grow. But it also is going to decrease the rate at which we use our carbohydrates, and it's going to increase the rate at which we use fats, which is not something you're going to immediately think about when you think about growth hormone. This is some of the more trickier stuff to associate with growth. All right, our next hormone from the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary gland to be specific, is prolactin. So prolactin, you may see it as a PRL, you may see it as lactotropin as well. Any of those are interchangeable. PRL is probably the most obvious one, but prolactin is going to make us think about something with lactation, and that's exactly what it does for women. So we can see our first group here. This is for women, and it is going to promote milk production. Promotes milk production in women. In men, it is going to maintain normal sperm production. So in men, maintains normal sperm production. So we have this one hormone that does different things for both men and women. So let's make sure we know what each of them do. Now, abnormal levels in men or women can absolutely disrupt sexual function, start causing some problems. Our next hormone from the anterior pituitary gland is thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. You'll also see this as thyrotropin because it got secreted by those thyrotropes initially back in the day. It controls the secretion of certain hormones from the thyroid gland. That makes sense. It doesn't get any easier than that. This is called thyroid stimulating hormone. So this is a hormone that's going to stimulate the thyroid. And it causes these thyroids, it encourages these thyroids, or it tells these thyroid glands to release their hormones. Get rid of it, start releasing hormones. That's what TSH is doing for us. Now, if we end up with too much TSH coming out of our anterior pituitary gland going to our thyroid gland, too much hormone, now our thyroid gland is secreting too much thyroid hormone. And as it secretes too much thyroid hormone, then that can cause a goiter where we get this swelling in our neck. And we don't want that. My next hormone from the anterior pituitary gland is ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. Now this one is very similar to what we just looked at with thyroid stimulating hormone. That was a hormone that stimulates the thyroid. This is going to be a hormone that stimulates the cortex of the adrenal gland. And that's really what we're looking at here. If we look at just the name, we know tropic from our previous slides is a hormone that causes other hormones to be released. So this is a hormone that causes other hormones to get released from the cortex of my adrenal gland. So my adrenal gland is broken up between my adrenal cortex and my adrenal medulla, and we're going to treat them like different hormone or different glands because they secrete different things, a lot like we're doing with our pituitary gland. We're treating our anterior and posterior like two different glands. We're going to do the same thing when we get to the adrenal gland, so that's why we're making that distinction of the cortex of the adrenal, because that's its own separate section. So if we look at the definition, it controls some hormones from the adrenal cortex. That's what we just said. Good. It is often also produced as a response to stress. So this is when we pump out to help deal with stress, the adrenocorticotropic hormone. Gonadotropins. So gonadotropins, there are three that act on the gonads. So your gonads are your goodies, your reproductive organs, your private parts. That's your gonads. So gonadotropins are the hormones that act on that. So we have three. Our first one, human chorionic gonadotropin, you may see it as HCG with a lowercase h with a capital C and G. These guys are produced by the placenta during pregnancy to help maintain the uterine lining. So and the chance that we have an embryo implant in the uterus, we need to maintain that uterus. We don't want it to slough off. We don't want to lose that uterus. So we're using gonadotropin to help us do that. So that's my first gonadotropic hormone. My second one is follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. In men, it stimulates sperm production. In women, it stimulates estrogen secretion. And also in women, it stimulates the development of the egg-containing follicle, follicle-stimulating hormone, egg-containing follicle. That's pretty straightforward. It's not going to get much easier than that. But again, this is another hormone that has different effects in both men and women. So let's make sure we make that distinction between the two. We know what it does in men, and we know what it does in women. And our last hormone from the anterior pituitary gland is luteinizing hormone, or LH. It's going to promote the secretion of sex hormones in both sexes, and it releases the egg in females. So the luteinizing hormone is actually what releases the egg cell, so it can be off to have a shot at getting fertilized in females. So let's just make note real quick before we close out our anterior pituitary. LH and FSH, those are my big gonadotropins. Those are the main ones. We really only use the other one when unless we become pregnant or we're expecting to become pregnant to maintain that uterine lining. These ones get used by everybody. These are your puberty hormones, which is why they fall under the gonadotropin kind of title to that. This is what encourages adolescents to go through puberty and helps their body start to change into adulthood. So that is my anterior pituitary. Next, let's look at the posterior pituitary. All right, the posterior pituitary gland is the other component of my pituitary, of course. This one is also known as the neurohypophysis. Almost died. The posterior pituitary gland, the other part of our pituitary, is also known as the neurohypophysis. And it's a much more, a little bit easier than the anterior pituitary. There's only two hormones. Now we do want to note that this one is directly attached through that infundibulum, that pituitary stalk, to my hypothalamus. So we get complete nervous control over my posterior pituitary, why we call it neuro. All right, so two hormones from my posterior pituitary. I've got my antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, as well as oxytocin. So with ADH, antidiuretic hormone, this is also known as vasopressin. And it is primarily concerned with water retention. So we use ADH to help conserve water. When it's being filtered out of the kidneys, we're going to pull that water back in to our bloodstream because we want to keep some of that water. And then we can kind of concentrate it later on as we need to. But because we are concerned with water retention, that means ADH plays a role in blood pressure, blood volume, tissue water content. Anything that's water-based, vasopressin or ADH is going to have a role in that. It's responsible for retaining that water. So if that gets messed up, then the whole water thing gets messed up. And that's what we see in conditions like diabetes insipidus. That's where we have a problem with our ADH or our vasopressin, and we're not conserving the water like we should. So that's where we get patients with polyuria that pee constantly, pee more than 3 liters a day. Their urine is clear, and they're constantly thirsty, always drinking. That's diabetes insipidus in a nutshell. And we want to make that association with ADH, antidiuretic hormone. And then lastly, for my posterior pituitary, is oxytocin. Good old oxytocin. So oxytocin, it contracts the muscles of the uterine wall, specifically those muscles that are in labor. So we can use this to induce labor. If it's time to have that baby, we're just not pushing yet, we can pop some oxytocin in there and get things moving along. It helps to induce contraction of those uterine muscles, which is going to expel the baby. It is also associated with milk-secreting glands. So if you're wanting to nurse and the milk just hasn't dropped down into those glands, we can get some oxytocin in there to help encourage that process. All right, that is the pituitary gland, both the anterior and the posterior. But remember, we're thinking them as two separate glands. This is a tough one. Good luck.